And that jarring cacophony tells you you're back once more with the Power of Three podcast. As we continue our look at the new adventures of Doctor Who, those original novels published in the 90s by Virgin Publishing. I'm Kenny Smith, and today we're looking at a book written by my fellow Scotsman. We're going to be putting First Frontier by David A. McIntee under the microscope. But what is First Frontier, you may be asking? It was the 30th New Adventures novel. It features the 7th Doctor Ace and Professor Bernice Summerfield. And, fascinatingly, this novel also featured the first in-novel regeneration of a character from the TV series, the Master. It was published on the 15th of September 1994 and had a cover by Tony Mazzero. It was one of 3 novels written by David A. McIntee that features the Master, according to TARDISFandom.com, with Virgin's Missing Adventures The Dark Path following in 1997, which we've previously featured on the podcast, and the BBC Past Doctor Adventures The Face of the Enemy, which was published in 1998. So let's start by taking a look at the cover. The New Adventures logo on this one is orange top and bottom in the bars, and it tells us First Frontier by David A. McIntee. In the background we can see there's a crashed spaceship, there's a diner and an American car. We can see a cactus over to the left, and there's some purple mountains in the background, but the main focus of this image is Ace, who's wearing her new rubbery combat suit thing. Interesting painting. Her body does look slightly elongated, but she's got a ponytail and shades on. Bit of Han Solo Chewbacca type bandolier and belt going on there with various gadgets on it. A bit like the Bat belt actually, utility belt there. And yeah, she's got a bit of a smile on her face, so Ace looks quite happy. Let's turn the book over and see what's on the back cover. It tells us, Ace raised her blaster. "You've already killed me once, girl," Greer said. "Didn't you learn anything from that?" You almost want to go hee at the end. When Bernice asks to see the dawn of the space age, the Doctor takes the TARDIS to the United States of America in 1957 and into the midst of distrust and paranoia. The Cold War is raging, bringing the world to the brink of atomic destruction. But the threat facing America is far more deadly than Communist Russia. The militaristic Zun Confederacy have made Earth their next target for conquest, and the aliens are already among us. 2 nuclear warheads have been stolen. There are traitors to the human species in the highest ranks of the army, and alien infiltrators have assumed human form. Only one person seems to know what's going on: the army's mysterious scientific advisor, the enigmatic Major Creer. Who could Major Creer be? Let's pause now and have the DWM prelude to the novel, and it's read for us by David Steele.
The cold stiffness was a meaningless feeling until Finney realised that it was a sensation of snowflakes freezing themselves to his face. He opened his eyes with some difficulty, blinking against the icy wind that drove in through both the shattered windscreen and a large rip in the Skytrain's fuselage just behind him. Everything seemed skewed. The curtain to the cargo compartment sagging towards the wall, while the co-pilot was hanging limply above him. Straightening himself in the canted cockpit, Finney realised that he could hear no sound from the cargo compartment. "Jim?" he prompted the co-pilot. There was no answer. "Lieutenant Mitchell?" he croaked, hoping to provoke a response. There was none, and Finney finally allowed himself to see the scarlet icicles that stretched out to him like grasping claws from Mitchell's nose and mouth. The co-pilot's yoke was jammed into his chest, the flight jacket there crumpled and thickly spread with frozen blood. Another piece of him dying, Finney tried to reach out to him, to reassure him that everything would be fine and his family would be proud of him. But he couldn't, for the words would be as empty as his heart, or the lives of the families. Weakly, Finney scraped at the release for his harness. It popped free at last, but he found that he still couldn't move, though he wanted little more than to get out from under the accusing gaze of the corpse above him. Looking to see what was holding him back, Finney almost passed out again with shock. His left leg was a scarlet block like a frozen side of beef, nailed to the inside of the fuselage by a jointed throttle cable support that was rammed through his thigh. The blood around it was solid and glassy, the sub-zero temperatures having stopped the flow, but also having numbed his body so much that he wouldn't even feel the wound. Shaking with more than just the cold, Finney retreated into himself, watching the snow as the flakes were tinted gold by some minor fires on the starboard wing. He wasn't sure whether to be afraid of the danger of an explosion or delighted that it would end it all. The light seemed steady, however, or perhaps pulsing softly along with the howling wind. Perhaps he was already dead, he thought. Wasn't Dante's innermost circle of hell a frozen wasteland embedded with lost souls? He didn't want to die so far from home, and more alone than anyone in the world. "Watch the door there," a breathless voice seemed to say somewhere in the depths of the howling wind. "It doesn't look at all steady." "Aye, I'm not blind, you know." "Well, the snow is rather thick," the first voice replied tartly. "We do get snow in the Highlands, you know." Finney's eyes, almost welded shut, cracked open again. These voices weren't hallucinations, surely. There were two people back there, he was sure. It sounded like an Englishman and a Scotsman, which meant they were probably from the British 41 Commando. They were attached to the 5th US Marines at Haguro, weren't they? "There's nothing we can do for these poor men," the first voice went on. "They must have died instantly." Finney tried to call to the men, but no sound would come from his raw throat. Fortunately, however, footsteps approached the bulkhead behind him, and a head popped through the tilted doorway. The green eyes at the heart of the lined face, which was topped with a limp mop of dark hair, glanced quickly over the body of the co-pilot and onto Finney. Summoning all his reserves of strength, Finney mouthed a silent thanks and weakly beckoned the newcomer over. His eyes widening, the new arrival climbed gingerly into the cockpit, stepping carefully over Finney to stand on the side window. The stranger didn't wear any uniform, however, but a very bulky fur coat, while his companion was wrapped up in a sheepskin jerkin and courageously wearing a kilt despite the weather. "Oh dear," the stranger announced. "You are in trouble, aren't you?" He craned over to examine the dark mass of Finney's leg. "We'll have to do something about that," he added, searching around in the bulky coat before drawing out a narrow metal object. The kilted youth looked at the wound, grimacing slightly. "He's lucky it's cold enough," he commented in a Scots burr. "Yes, if it wasn't so chilly, he'd have bled to death," the strange Englishman agreed. Finney tried to look towards his leg, feeling a strange warm tingling in it. There was a hollow tugging sensation. "Ah, this is the problem," the stranger exclaimed, holding up the cable support. "Very nasty." Yellow lights flickered outside, and the Scot looked out of the two small panes set in the ceiling, which was now a wall. "Somebody's coming, Doctor," he pointed out. "They've a big red cross on their wagon." "Excellent! We can leave this poor chap in the care of the professionals." He hopped back over the slumped Finney, pocketing the slim metal object. Finney felt something pressed into his stiff palm. "A souvenir," the stranger murmured with an infectious smile. "Come on, Jamie. Zoe will be worried about us by now, if she'd noticed we're gone." Finney watched as the two strangers disappeared into the darkness at the rear of the plane, their voices swallowed up by the howling wind. Somewhere far beyond the fragile shell of atmosphere that sheathed the earth, adrift in infinite darkness, a razor-edged blade gleamed. Its point hanging directly towards the small blue planet in its path, the starship slid back into normal space as easily as the sword it resembled would slide into flesh. The desert skies were clear enough that one could almost see the texture of the inky darkness between the stars. An echoing howl rippled across the stifled landscape as a pair of jets banked round the proving grounds off in the distance, but Coyote Eyes, or so his name translated into English, ignored the aircraft. The planes had been crisscrossing the land long enough for him to know their sound and their every possible image. It wasn't the aircraft or the rockets that had persuaded him to pack his small suitcase. "Look," Jack Siegel cajoled, "I know you've some vacation due, but can't you wait until Rick has moved to his own place? With so many of us to cook for." "I could still cook for you, if you came away from here also." Coyote Eyes gestured skywards with a strong but gnarled hand. "If you're smart, you'll move away from this area, for a couple of weeks at least." Jack looked upwards, but saw nothing other than a gently pulsing light that he thought could be a plane or a meteor. "It's not safe here," Coyote Eyes went on. "The skies are giving us warning, Jack. Soon, Nyanzangi." slayer of alien gods, and Toba Sistini, child of the water, the brothers of light and darkness, will walk the earth. The flying demons and I already own the skies. Those lights you see. Coyote Eyes tossed his luggage into his battered 48 pickup. The old Navajo cook fixed the rancher with a calm, matter-of-fact look. You should all leave. But if you must stay, then protect yourselves. They may come for you, the slayer of alien gods, and perhaps the poison woman. Poison? To sleep with her is death. It is a legend of the lost ones, the Ansazi. The old man climbed into the driver's seat. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. If there's anything to come back to.
Thank you once again, Dave, for that. Now, you may remember that we previously featured David's first novel, White Darkness, on The Power of Three. And if you didn't hear it, then go back and listen to it. It's still available. And we mentioned then that we'd actually spoken to David about coming on the podcast to discuss all of his new adventures, which we'd planned to discuss, which we'd planned to cover the three of them in one recording, but sadly he passed away in December 2024, so we weren't able to do that. However, David has regularly spoken about writing this book, and we've been able to bring together some interviews for you. But of course, something David always did was write an introduction to each of his novels and put a fair bit of his personality in there. So let's have a quick reading of that, which I'm going to tell you from the start of First Frontier. Author's notes. Yes, I'm sorry, but I'm at it again. Before I get on with acknowledgements for this book, I'd like to add another for White Darkness, namely thanks to Phil Bevan for his illustrations to the prelude in DWM 201. This was all done long after the book was finished. Hence, I obviously couldn't mention him then. This time, thanks are due to Peter and Rebecca, that'll be Darvel Evans and Levine, obviously for commissioning this book and being so helpful during the writing process. Free drinks at the conservatory in particular. Gary Clubb for the odd one-liner, and Gary Russell, but I can't see why without spoiling the major plot twist. And last but not least, Tony Mazzero for the splendid cover. This has been another research-heavy book, and I wouldn't want to leave you without a few pointers as to the non-fiction sources. The organisations referred to all did or do exist, though the IPU was disbanded in 1947. That's dramatic licence. All the locations also really exist, with the exception, for reasons which will become obvious, of Corman AFB, though it is a combination of different elements attributed to different bases in UFO myth. The main sources of research for this facet, and the occasional UFO report, which has been fictionalised here, were Aliens from Space by Donald Keyhoe, Above Top Secret by Timothy Good, the reports of Robert Lazar, which appeared in Alien Liaison, edited by Timothy Good, Farewell Good Brothers, an Oscar-winning short documentary about 1950s contactees, and finally, Finnish TV's UFOs, which was shown on BBC Two over Christmas 1993. The characters are fictional, except for Shadow. That's David's cat. Finally, I've been warned to mention my mum and dad, who complained when I didn't do so last time. If you're wondering what to expect here, well, last time I did a doom-laden historical. Next time, chance would be a fine thing, I plan a doom-laden historical. So for now, let's just have some fun, eh? Cue the White Circle. This book was of course released when The X-Files was a big thing in world television, so UFO paranoia, conspiracies and the like were very much in the zeitgeist, and David has absolutely tapped into that. So, we're now going to hear extracts from his interview with Doctor Who magazine. This appeared in issue 222 in the feature Writing New Who, and he was interviewed by Craig Hinton. And I'm delighted that our podcast regular co-conspirator, Dr John Bollan, has read out David's words. So, Craig started by asking David A. McIntee's second new adventure was the entertaining First Frontier, an investigation into the UFO craze of the 50s. What gave him the idea?
I was surprised that nobody had done a UFO story before. Initially I came up with an outline that I still think is a bit more original than the final version of First Frontier, where the aliens turned out to be creatures from a parallel dimension that occasionally slipped into our own, feeding on fear and paranoia. Once they'd been thought of as elves and fairies, but by the 50s they were seen as aliens and UFOs. Virgin then pointed out that they had covered Celtic mythology in Witchmark, but they liked the UFO elements, so I had to do bug-eyed monsters. But the first half of the book is virtually the same. Then again I wondered how to do it seriously, and in the end I couldn't. That's why there's a lot of humour in it.
First Frontier was notable for the return and the regeneration of the Master. Whose idea was it to include him?
Definitely mine. Initially I wanted to do the last Roger Delgado Master story. It would have explained Gallifreyan meantime, the way in which all Time Lords meet one another in chronological order, by being the exception that proved the rule, and it would have finished the Master becoming as he was in The Deadly Assassin. But when I was told that it had to be the post-survival Anthony Ainley Master, I asked if I could regenerate him. After a lot of additional persuasion by Gary Russell, they agreed, and we came up with the idea of his looking like Basil Rathbone as he was in the film The Adventures of Robin Hood. Basically, I wanted the new Master to have the characteristics of Delgado's Master, but I also wanted a contrast with the Ainley version. A lot came from a character called Carswell from the film Night of the Demon, as well as Timothy Dalton's role in The Rocketeer. And then there were touches of Julian Glover, Ricardo Montalban, and a bit of myself. Well, bad guys have more fun.
Most of the Master's previous aliases were plays on his name. Why did he call himself Creer in First Frontier?
Creer was a malevolent hypnotist played by Roger Delgado in an episode of The Avengers, one of my little in-jokes. Originally, there was going to be a lot more of the Master's personality in the book, about why he was a power-crazed psycho. I tried dropping little bits in along the way, but the Master is covered by the same guidelines as the Doctor. He's a Time Lord, and revealing their thought processes lessens their alien nature, so that was removed. I also wanted to have him manipulate Ace into shooting him because his death wish, or regeneration wish, was countered by his survival instinct, so someone else had to do it. That was toned down so it wasn't as obvious as I'd wanted it to be, and I wanted to keep the Master a secret. Virgin wanted him on the cover, but I protested. I didn't want to spoil the twist.
David then pointed out an interesting interpretation of the Master.
In a way, the Master is the hero in the book. They'd soon leave the Earth voluntarily, but vow to return. And then the Master destroys them in the same way that the Doctor destroys the Daleks in remembrance of the Daleks. I submitted 3 or 4 pure science fiction proposals between White Darkness and First Frontier, and they got rejected. But then I submitted a pseudo-historical, and they need research, which I love. In fact, Steve Lyons calls me Mr. Historical. I love all those tabloid stories about UFOs. They're so easy to rip off. I also read all the stuff from the Flying Saucer Brigade, as well as everything about the US military of the time. And naturally, I watched all the stories with the Master in them. I find the hardest part of a book is the dialogue. Once you get that out of the way, everything else is much easier. I loved writing all the action sequences, all that James Bond stuff. And as for the Master and Ace, I really enjoyed writing for the Master, but a number of writers reckon that Ace is difficult to write for. I didn't find that at all.
David also spoke to Simon Guerrier about First Frontier, and courtesy of Simon, here is the full interview text. And again, this has been read for us by John Bollan. So Simon started by asking, next was First Frontier, and again, I'd like to know if that was your first pitch, or whether others fell by the wayside.
Again, I pitched a different thing first, with the idea of a 30th anniversary book in which Susan comes back and had turned evil. She would also turn the TARDIS evil. The Toon were in that. Then there was a version of First Frontier, which would be very different from the finished version. There were fairies instead of Toon. That element ended up in Autumn Mist, and two masters. The Ainley version trying to prevent the Delgado version from ending up as a skeletal one and thus fucking up his life forevermore.
Were Benny and New Ace easier to write this time around?
Pretty much, because of course by this time other books with them had come out.
Were there things you'd learned on the first book about them, or more generally, that made it easier this time around?
Absolutely, both from seeing them in action in other books and from the learning experience of writing the things.
You regenerate and reinvent the Master, and then a lot of your subsequent books are missing and past Doctor adventures. Do you think you're more comfortable writing past Doctor books? And if so, why is that?
Bluntly, because I know those Doctors better. I didn't always manage to keep up with the ongoing NA-EDA series and this show's in Autumn Mist, whereas a past Doctor has all those episodes to go by.
And finally we're going to turn to the pages of Doctor Who magazine in issue 343, where David spoke to David Darlington about his many books, and one of them of course covered was First Frontier. So Davey said, when you came to write your second novel, First Frontier, you were given the chance to utilise a character which many people regard as one of your obsessions, the Master.
People do say this, yes. I remember a review of Wages of Sin which said, you sometimes wonder in a McIntee book if the Master hasn't turned up by chapter whatever, there must have been a misprint. But I've only used him 3 times. 12 books, 3 times. I think he's an interesting character. The anti-Doctor, equal but opposite, which is why I think the Valyard's a waste of time. We've already got the Master, and I really wanted to explore the relationship between him and the Doctor. That's why there's a moral argument between them in First Frontier, which the Master wins. The Doctor will give a lecture about non-violence and then blow something up, whereas the Master is at least more honest. I also wanted to bring back some of the charm and depth that was lost in some of the later TV stories. But I've done all I wanted to do with them now.
Huge thanks to John for those readings, and again thanks to Simon for providing the interview with David that featured in Bernice Summerfield, The Inside Story. Now, let's pause here, and it's time for another reading from the book, and this time Dave Steele is going to bring us the first encounter between Benny and Anthony Ainley's incarnation of the Master.
Slipping quietly down the narrow companionway, Benny ran a hand along the dull grey wall, her eyes following the ribbed cables along the ceiling to the simply formed speakers that would blare out alerts in time of battle. It was all terrific stuff, she thought. There was an almost obsessive use of metal, with not a single neoplast fitting in sight. It was wonderful, and she had to resist the urge to take notes as she went. Something began to intrude itself into her mind, however, distracting her from her gleeful examination of the fascinatingly primitive structure of the ship. Cocking her head slightly, she listened carefully, trying to single out the sound that had piqued her interest among the jumble of other hums and creaks of the ship. Despite the attraction of the long-forgotten material and design of her current environment, Benny moved off further down the corridor, realising that the sound was coming from behind a closed door at the end of the passage. It was also getting louder. It seemed to be a sort of echoing musical tone, with a strange backing that rose and fell. It was an oddly familiar sound, and Benny tried the door, only to find that it was locked. For a moment, she was glad that the ship wasn't moving, or the rising and falling tone would probably have had her stomach coming out in sympathy with it. At least you couldn't get seasick in the TARDIS, she thought with a faint inward smile. The expression froze on her face. That was what was familiar about the sound, she realised. It was like the TARDIS, but different somehow. Newer, she suddenly thought. That was it, not as worn as the TARDIS. It stopped with a bass crunch, as if something heavy had settled down. Benny bent to the lock, trying to peer through the keyhole, but the interior of the cabin was pitch black. Pulling out a small dental scraper she normally used for scraping soft rock away from delicate fossils, she knelt in front of the door. With extreme delicacy, she inserted the scraper into the lock, started to feel around gingerly for the barrel. Abruptly, a dull blur appeared in front of her eyes with a metallic rattle. It was, naturally, a set of keys, and she didn't need the doctor's foresight to know that one of them would be for this door. Telling herself resignedly that it wasn't as if she shouldn't have got used to this sort of thing by now, she straightened slowly. Turning, she found an Air Force Major nodding understandingly. "There can't be too many Air Force Majors running around with alien friends and stolen warheads," she commented. "You are Major Creer, I presume?" "I am many things," Creer acknowledged. He gestured with a stubby black device in his gloved hand. It looked to Benny either like a weapon or a sex toy, and she didn't even think he would consider this a proper time or place. He held the weapon steadily. "Take me to your leader?" Benny raised her hands. "I don't believe that should be necessary. I'm already here, Miss Summerfield. Bernice Summerfield. My friends call me Benny, but you can call me Professor Summerfield." "Bernice Summerfield?" Creer looked surprised. "That's why your face was familiar." Ignoring her look of astonishment, he leaned carefully past her and unlocked the door. "Your parlour, I presume?" Creer indicated that she should enter, and there didn't seem to be much choice. She turned the handle and pushed. The room beyond was filled from deck to ceiling with instruments that were clearly of local design and manufacture, reconfigured into bizarre and anachronistic networks. She recognised a few pieces of Zun technology, forming the central nodes of several linkages. A medium-sized black cat watched her impassively through luminescent eyes. "Are all the white ones copyrighted?" Benny asked, nodding towards it. Strangest of all was some sort of Ionic-style fluted sandstone column, which was totally out of place in the cabin of a destroyer. The weapon never wavering from Benny's midriff, Creer ran a hand along the weathered stone, his face displaying such satisfaction that she half expected him to light a cigarette like in the old movies. "Sometimes even time isn't such a successful thief after all," he muttered to himself. "Even with this primitive equipment, the Stadenheim remote control principle works perfectly." He turned back to Benny. "I believe the usual parlance in this era would be, what is a respected archaeologist like you doing in a place like this?" "Do you know me?" Benny demanded. "Only by reputation," he answered smoothly. "I read your paper on the foundations of Martian feudalism." "Nice to know I have some satisfied customers." She smiled uncertainly. How could he possibly have read her work, which wouldn't be published for over half a millennium? A nasty suspicion was forming in her mind. "Your conclusions were all wrong, of course," he added snidely, "but not by as much as I might have expected from a human." "What?" Professional outrage thrummed in Benny's muscles, and she almost took a step forwards, regardless of the strange weapon. "How could a 20th century Air Force officer have heard of me? Just who are you, really?" "Hasn't the doctor told you about me?" Creer tutted softly. He always did have a shaky grasp of the important issues. His feral smile exposed pointed teeth amidst the neatly trimmed beard. "I am known as the Master," he announced simply, then smiled to himself. "Universally."
Thanks again, Dave. Of course, it would be interesting to hear the regeneration, wouldn't it? Well, shall we bring that later? Yeah, I think we shall. Okay, let's do what we usually do now after we've heard from the author and turn to the pages of Doctor Who magazine for their review. And this is from issue 217, in which Craig Hinton reviewed it. And Shelf Life had been given a new look with this issue. Let's find out what Craig thought. America 1957, and Robert Agar is quite literally going where no man has gone before, aboard a flying saucer. But what is the relationship between his friendly Venusians and the occupants of the UFOs, which are buzzing fighters from a nearby military base? And who is Major Creer, an Air Force officer with a mysterious hidden agenda? Into this era of paranoia, where McCarthyism fuels racial and political hatred, comes a unique trio of sightseers: the Doctor, Ace and Benny. Before long, their holiday snaps include spaceships and a family who claim to have been abducted by aliens. When the base gets hold of a crashed UFO, the Doctor doesn't really have much choice. It's time to get involved. If he had known that an old enemy was waiting in the wings, and that a massive alien vessel was in orbit waiting to invade, well, would it really have made much difference? First Frontier, ISBN 0426 20421-2 is the second new adventure from the pen of David McIntee. His previous one, White Darkness, was the first book I reviewed for DWM way back in issue 201, and I thoroughly enjoyed that one. So, does First Frontier live up to my expectations? One of the things that shone in White Darkness was his attention to historical accuracy. And First Frontier is no different. David has researched American culture and UFO lore in intricate detail, and it shows. From the wonderful descriptions of 50s military hardware to an authentic American small town, this sort of background always gives a novel that extra dimension. As for characterisation, the behaviour and interactions of the regulars are perfect. Benny's archaeological skills get a mention for the first time in ages, and you actually believe she is from the future. Ace undergoes a welcome burst of character development as she begins to wonder how long she can carry on fighting. Perhaps she is almost ready to settle down. And the Doctor displays the correct mix of mystery and blind panic that sums up his seventh persona. The supporting cast are just as entertaining, from the sadly misled Agar to Marion Davison, a woman in a prejudiced man's world. Yet, there is an unreal, almost B-movie feel to all of them. But this isn't a complaint. First Frontier is a full-blooded homage to those wonderfully kitsch films of the 50s, such as Invaders from Mars and This Island Earth. The invaders themselves, the Tsun, are a creepy blend of classic monster and 90s hard science, whose machinations are a magnificent updating of the old body snatchers routine. First Frontier definitely lives up to my expectations. Another winner from Mr. McIntee. Pros: convincing aliens, the Rocky Horror Show joke, the twist. Cons: not being able to reveal the twist here. Verdict: 4 stars. It's very easy to forget, with the benefit of hindsight, that the appearance of the Master was, of course, a surprise in this book, and it's something that we all know about these days as it's part and parcel of discussing First Frontier. I had to look back to Doctor Who magazine to see if there was any reaction, and there was a letter in DWM issue 223, which came from Jan Mielkosk of Doncaster in Yorkshire, and he wrote in about this book. And he doesn't actually discuss what you'd expect him to mention. He said, having just finished David McIntee's First Frontier, I again found myself somewhat disappointed with the inaccurate dialogue and superfluous padding, which seems to bedevil many of the new adventures. On the whole, First Frontier was a good story. It was nice to have the Master back. But since when have Ace and Benny used the word smeg? When did Ace develop a vocabulary which is on a par with that of most Oxbridge undergraduates? The Doctor's dialogue also seems to have deviated seriously from the television days. Sylvester McCoy, like his predecessors, had a distinctive way of speaking, which has been faithfully recaptured by a number of Doctor Who novelists in the past, but seems to be beyond the capabilities of many New Adventures authors. On the subject of padding, First Frontier is not the worst offender by a long way. Cut out the superfluous bits from some New Adventures and you would be left with around 100 pages. Virgin has set a minimum requirement of 85,000 words for the New Adventures. It seems as though some authors, suddenly realising that their stories are going to fall short of their target, inject large sections which have little relevance to the plot. This distracts the reader from the gist of the story, leading frequently to confusion. What happened to plain simple storytelling? It is one thing to provide the reader with a setting to explain certain actions. It is another altogether to waffle just to fill up space. There are many talented writers out there with Doctor Who stories they would like to tell. Unfortunately, because their compositions aren't long enough or their professional backgrounds don't involve writing and performing, they are being overlooked, while others who appear to have little grasp of Doctor Who, the Seventh Doctor in particular, have their work published almost without question. Come on, Virgin, let's have some good stories with accurate dialogue. And if they don't surpass 85,000 words, well, so what? Weren't some of the 2-part television stories as good as the 4 or 6-part ones? I suspect Jan may be a failed New Adventures writer without having got anything published, but it seems very strange that there's not been much of a reaction to discuss a regenerated Master. Very strange indeed. Anyway, let's move on and have our final reading from the book, again courtesy of Dave Steele.
Ace looked on in guilty anguish as Manco's shrivelled form stopped twisting at last. She looked murderously at the Master, who flattened himself against the side of an equipment locker. Almost imperceptibly, even to herself, Ace's finger began to tighten on the trigger of her blaster. Whether due to pheromones from the only other affected survivor of the cheetah planet, or her ingrained training and experience as a soldier, the coppery scent of blood in the air teased some forgotten part of Ace's subconscious, which hungered for more. She had failed in her responsibility to keep her force safe, she knew, and reminded herself that it was her duty to avenge him. She fought down the primitive urges with visible effort, aided only by the memory of the lifeless and accusing faces of Paul Richmond and all the others whose lives she had helped to end for good or for ill. The Master, already close to the open locker door, covered Ace and Benny with a tissue compression eliminator as he turned to dart for the dark space. Even though the door was already open for him, Ace was fast enough to shoot him in the dead centre of his chest, just before the door of his TARDIS closed over the almost comical look of surprise in his face. Shadow hissed as the Master was pitched into his TARDIS. He writhed with pain as he crawled to the console, a trail of blood glistening behind him. Reaching the console, he pulled himself up, his flailing hand managing to trigger the door lever before pulling down on the dematerialisation switch. The Kittling watched, as impassively as only cats can, as he slid to the ground, the crisp stench of scorched flesh tainting the air. The Master fought hard against the tide of pain that threatened to drown him, pulling himself onto his knees. "So close," he groaned. "So close." Shadow drew back, startled, as the Master pitched to the floor in front of her, his fangs bared in a rictus of pain. Grinding his teeth, he scraped at his chest with one clawed hand, pressing in with his fingers as if he was trying to tear out the pain that burned within him. As he writhed on the floor, the illumination faded fitfully as the symbiotically controlled lighting elements died with their Master's consciousness. "Let me be free," the Master gasped, clutching his head as it began to burn with a greater fire than the wound in his chest. Shadow watched silently, the tip of her tail twitching, as the burning pain that was consuming the Master became visible. As if he were undergoing spontaneous combustion, dull fiery embers lit the ravaged Time Lord's contorted face. While his TARDIS's power source throbbed erratically, the Master curled into a ball beneath the console, his only thought to hide away from the pain. The fire in his veins was even worse than that which had seared his and Shadow's linked minds when leaping from the exploding cheetah planet. In front of his eyes, the material of his clenched gloves began to shift, bulging outwards under pressure from the flesh within. The pain began to ease, drifting off as if the consciousness that perceived it had disassociated itself from the form that experienced it. Gradually, light began to seep back into the console room, bathing the sprawled and still figure with a moonlit glow. "Free?" he murmured hopefully, in a light yet rich and cultured voice. His eyes opened, wincing at even this faint light. He focused immediately on the hands before him. Through the tears that his claws had made in the leather, smooth skin was visible. No fur. He pulled off the gloves, examining the long pianist's fingers beneath in wonder. With a frown, he walked unsteadily around the console to the nearest deactivated monitor screen and peered at the reflection it offered. "I appear to have survived," he muttered thoughtfully, then laughed to himself, in a tired and mirthless fashion that indicated that perhaps this was his least desired fate. As he straightened out, however, and put any such depressing thoughts out of his head, the laughter became more genuine and relieved. He looked down at himself, noting that his scorched uniform was too short and too loose by a couple of inches each way. Stroking the glossy moustache that didn't quite meet the neat beard which covered his proud chin, both of them framing his narrow mouth, the Master laughed triumphantly. His high forehead and aristocratic nose tilted ceilingwards, while his lean face cracked into a delighted grin.
So there we go. We get to see the Master regenerate, long before we get to see it happen on screen in Utopia. Let's move over to Goodreads now and have a look at what readers think about the book today. And First Frontier has a rating of 3.29. That's from 191 ratings and 29 reviews. 5 stars, 14%, 4 stars, 23%, 3 stars, 43%, 2 stars, 16%, and 1 star, 2%. And we'll have a look through some of these reviews now and we'll give you a flavour of what people are saying. 5 stars from Zanksa. When I first started this, I thought it would be a standard alien invasion scenario of the kind I've read and seen on TV and in movies many times ad nauseum. Although it has elements of those standard invasion scenarios, the addition of a much-loved character and some interesting new guest characters lifted it above the mundane. 4 stars from Keoru. Until 2/3 of the pages into the book, I thought that it wasn't much more than just a solid romp of a story. Not too great, but not too bad either, and it passed the time rather well. Then there suddenly came this surprise reveal of the villain, and I went, oh! I should have seen it coming if I had really been paying attention to all the clues and hints throughout the story, but, well, I wasn't. Since it was just such of a prime example of a cosy romp, I didn't really expect anything of that sort to happen, and, well, in the end, it still isn't much more of a romp, but hey, it's a romp with a major surprise twist. How about that? Anyway, that cover really is a bit crap, isn't it? What the hell happened to the anatomy of poor Ace? Who let that kind of thing pass, and why didn't anybody notice before sending it to the printer? 4 stars from City Mist. David A. McIntee does a better job of incorporating Doctor Who into the American UFO craze of the 1950s than Paul Cornell. Sorry, City Mist, it was actually Alan Barnes. In Dreamland, 15 years later, but his writing suffers from a surplus of characters and technical detail. There's a 3-star review from Scurra. David McIntee found a nice niche for his new adventures, a solid historical setting which has room for the SF elements without you feeling that they are completely implausible. Here, he takes the 50s UFO scares in the US and parlays it into a proper alien invasion story. There is a genuinely excellent twist involving one of the major characters, which is almost but not entirely a surprise. And it nicely deals with a long-standing loose end from the TV show. Sadly, however, the story itself is rather routine, and there are few surprises, but more than a few ridiculous back-and-forth sequences in which characters go somewhere, come back, and go away again just to enable the plot to work. And there are times when you lose track of where things are happening when there are 2 separate army bases, with aliens apparently at both of them. The aliens are quite nicely realised, with a plausible and unusual military culture. But again, it gets confusing as to where the different aliens are and what their motivation is. Not a great entry in the series, but definitely not a clunker either. And finally, there's a 2-star review from The Bookseller. Going to be honest, I can't get on with David A. McIntee's writing style. I don't know what it was, but I really struggled. He also has a writing habit to give every character a name. Gary Russell did the same thing in Legacy. The problem with it is that you, as the reader, will do your best to remember every name's character. This is because it should be an indication from the writer that these characters are important and will reappear later. However, when every character is named, and I mean every character, from a one-off guard, motel clerk or even a passerby, it just becomes too much. You can't possibly remember all those characters, it becomes overwhelming and you stop trying. Then suddenly, a character you didn't bother to remember appears and turns out to be a major contributor to the plot. Sadly, I didn't manage to finish this. So there we go. That was First Frontier. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, feel free to follow us on social media as Power of 3 Pod on Twitter, and we'll be sharing bonus content such as the illustrations from the DWM Prelude by the brilliant Phil Bevan. They'll also be on our Facebook page and on our Blue Sky, which is at Finished Zine. And of course, if you have enjoyed the episode, feel free to leave a review wherever you get your podcasts from. Now we're going to head off and we're going to leave you with a piece of music. And this is a piece of music called First Frontier. But you're thinking, that's a bit of a coincidence. But no, it's not actually. It's from Cybertech 2 Pharos, the album which featured an awful lot of music from New Adventures. There's tracks there called Legacy, Mastermind, Time's Crucible, and yeah, you can see where this is going. There's even the Nightshade TV theme, so yes, you get the picture. So, we're going to leave you with First Frontier by Cybertech. Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. Bye-bye.